Okay, I'm going to start you off with telling us your name and your age.
My name is John Bock. I'll be 72 next month, about a month.
And where did you come from?
I grew up in Lincoln, Illinois, and went to Elmhurst College, and then Eden Seminary. And during my 3 years at Eden Seminary in St. Louis, I did a student internship at Zion United Church of Christ in South Bend, Indiana. And that's where I met my wife, Carol, and we were married a year later. So I graduated from seminary in 1965 and served a small church in southern Indiana in a little town called Westphalia for a little over 6 years, and came here in the fall of 1971. So that will be 40 years ago this fall.
And what drew you to Elmore?
Well, I grew up on a farm, so the fact that Elmore was a small town with a rural area and farm people was one of the things that was interesting, but also the fact that Elmore was near Toledo was of interest to both my wife and I, and that we felt there were more things to offer our children who had been born in southern Indiana when they were growing up here. School system was another big factor because our daughter had just started kindergarten, so we were looking to move before she started into school.
And so you were pastor over at St. John's, and can you tell me any of the highlights of your time there?
It took me a while to get acquainted. Part of that was because I had developed a very close relationship with the people I served in Salem Church in Westphalia, Indiana. And without thinking about it, I assumed that it would just be an automatic transition. Didn't realize you had to build those relationships and support and trust all over again. So it took a while. Two things really helped in the early years of my ministry. In 1973, there was a program called Key 73. I think that was primarily supported or pushed by the Methodists, but it was Bible study for all denominations. And that started the churches in Elmore cooperating more together. And then, of course, in 1976 was the bicentennial. And all kind of special programs took place in Elmore at that time. And the churches got involved in that. We had a big community service, 4th of July weekend down at the football field. I think there were over 800 people there. And most of us ministers grew beards. Mine came in red, which was interesting. And so those were some things that I feel really started the churches and the community working well together. One of the things that helped me realize how important churches were in Elmore is that I guess it was the first year I was here, I was talking to some people, and they were talking about Woodville being the lime capital of the world, and Castalia having the Blue Hole, and Sandusky having Cedar Point, and all of these things. And so jokingly I said, and what's Elmore famous for? And without hesitation the person said, it's churches. And I think, they were very serious. That time there were 8 churches, there are still 6 today. And that is a very important part of the Elmore community.
Is there any people that inspired you in your congregation that helped you along?
Well, let me kind of reflect on that. The next thing that happened as far as a community endeavor, and this does involve some people, while I was at Westphalia, Indiana, those 6 years, the church built a retirement community. And so I had some interest and experience that when I came here in that. And I hadn't been here too long before I found out that Dr. Reitenauer and Blair Miller were both interested in having senior citizen housing here in Elmore. So I told them about my experience, and we tried to find a sponsoring organization. Kiwanis thought that was too big a project for them, even though the Tiffin Kiwanis Club has a retirement home. It's a high-rise. So after discussing various possibilities, again, the churches came together and they became the sponsoring organization, and representatives, I think, of 6 different churches are still have the board members on the governing board for the retirement village. And I just came across something last week. I think that was dedicated in 1979. So there was surveys and a lot of work that had to be done prior to that. One of the big challenges was the fact that we talked about building 30 or 32 apartments, and with the 5 acres that had been given us by, I think Mr. Hanneman gave us that. I'm not positive, but I think I'm right on that. We were told by the Farmers Home Administration, who is the funding organization, that with 5 acres we needed to have 64 apartments. And that really scared a number of people in that, will we ever be able to fill them? You know, there aren't that many retired people around here. Will they come from other locations? But as it developed, I don't think there's ever been a time when there hasn't been a waiting list. And you know, that's 25 years now that almost that's been going on.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you know any of the history of your church at all?
It started in 1861. Started by some Lutheran ministers. Well, it started with a group of people, but they had Lutheran ministers come in to preach and teach and that kind of thing. Our first location was on what was called Piety Hill, which is not Congress Street, but over
Harris, I believe.
Harris Street, yes. And the parsonage, I think, is what was the parsonage is still standing, and where the church stood is a brick home now, and then there was also a school with that. And then it was in 1921 that the building was built on Rice Street, 448 Rice Street, and that still stands and is serving the congregation well. It's built on what's called the Akron plan, so it's a semicircle, and it has a balcony, and then there were Sunday school rooms on both the main floor and the balcony, and those were opened up at times to provide overflow seating. And probably the biggest attendance I saw there was when Peg Ridenauer started the community course, a musical choir, and again that was involved the churches in the community. I think there may have been 40 voices or so in that, but their first concert was given in St. John's Church, and I think there were over 450 people attended that. There were several times on Easter or Christmas when we had 400, but that was unusual. And a lot of those seats have since been removed, and one Sunday school room was made into a conference room, and another one a cry room for children, so lots of adjustments have been made. I think it was in the 80s, 1980s, that we undertook a remodeling project on the basement, and we took out the old windows and made smaller windows and put in new windows. We put air conditioning in the basement, but not the sanctuary. That was too big a project. But the big part of that remodeling project was an elevette, or a small elevator. And again, the German people being proud and independent, some of them said they would never use it, but many of them have since. And it's a big asset when there's a wedding with grandparents who need assistance or in a wheelchair. Funerals, other activities. The elevator has been a very important part of that remodeling project. And it was several years later that we found out we could air condition the sanctuary without too much more expense. So those were the major projects that took place as far as the building goes. We had a strong youth program. Most of the time I was there. And a number of leaders in the community, Jack and Marilyn Clare, were active youth leaders. Marlene Giesler, who eventually married a minister, and now he's retired. She was part of our youth program. Bruce Card was an important part of our youth program over the years, and various other parents helped out. One of the activities that grew while I was there was a couples club. They were parents of young children. They were very active, and I developed a reputation for being the potluck minister. Every time we had a special activity, we had to have food, and I have developed a real expertise at knowing how to load a plate at a potluck.
That's something good to know.
Yes, I have lots of experience. We also had a very active senior citizens group at church before the county and area one came along. So I think that kind of provided an interest in having the community one. But they would meet once a month and play bingo and eat, of course.
Are a lot of those still active today?
Most of those senior citizens are no longer with us here on Earth. Many of them have died because 20 years ago they were in their 70s and 80s. And Margaret Kuhlman is, I think, the oldest member now. She's at Riverview. But I had the privilege of knowing a couple of members who were over 100. Grandma Cruz, who is well known in the community for making yarn around hangers. Lots of people have a Grandma Cruz hanger. And then she also made donuts, but only a select few benefited from that expertise she had.
Yeah, I saw that in one of the cookbooks there.
Yes.
I bet it's hard to duplicate.
Yes. My wife has tried, and it's not as easy as it looks.
Well, to get off the church a little bit, you said that your kids went to school here. What did you think about the schools? How have they changed since your children went to today?
Well, I haven't kept involved as much in the last few years. As I had said earlier, our daughter was in kindergarten when we moved here. Our son was 2 years old. And so they both went to Woodmore schools, all of their elementary and high school education. And during those years, I think the school system was very good. And it prepared both of our children for college. Tammy went to Heidelberg College, Tim went to Ohio Northern, and they were pretty well prepared for college. And they had to work at it, but they were both pretty good students. One of the special experiences, both being at the church and in the community, was when our daughter got married in 1988. And that was a special time for us as a family and the church and the community. And Tim got married someplace else where his wife lived, but that was a special time.
Did you get to marry them?
No. Our daughter Tammy was very specific. She wanted me to be the father, be her father at their wedding. And I'm sure part of that was due to the fact that during their growing up years, there were many times when I was busy with church activities and didn't always take the time I probably should have to be a father to them. So following her example, when our son got married, he told me he wanted me to enjoy the wedding, and how I could best do that. was what he wanted me to do. So again, I chose to be the father rather than the minister, and I've always felt good about setting that example of being the father. I know lots of my minister friends have done their children's weddings, but I was glad that I did it the way I did. And for our daughter, she had a neighboring minister from Genoa, Bob Wademan, do her wedding. And then when his son got married, I performed that service for him, so we just switched off on that one. Paul Deppen, a retired minister here in town, who used to be at Genoa, helped with our son's wedding, so we did have minister friends help with both weddings.
That's cool. What did you think about the businesses back in the 70s? I know a lot of them have gone out now, and so
Yes.
what do you remember?
The first business I remember getting acquainted with was Elmore Hardware. Myron Helwig was the owner and operator at that time. And before I this is how I got introduced to Myron's sense of humor. When we were getting things for the parsonage and moving in, I went down and asked if I could charge things, and he said, sure. So we just put it on a charge account, all the little things we were getting. And a week or so later, I came in, and without cracking a smile or batting an eye, he said, oh, by the way, I checked your credit. You can't charge anything, and your wife can charge up to $10. I looked at him, and then he just cracked up. That was Myron's sense of humor. It was the beginning of a very good relationship we had with Myron and his family, and still good friends with Jay and the other kids. I remember Jaeger Hardware. Didn't go there as often because I got acquainted with Myron. And the Bank of Elmore was different in those days, and insurance companies were different. I don't remember if all the buildings had a business in at that time, but of course in recent years the antique business has become a mainstay for downtown Elmore.
When did those come in? Do you remember?
No, I don't exactly. Somebody else would have to. I think that was within the last 10 or 15 years. But also, Jim Ford did a lot for the town and the businesses, bought many of the buildings and remodeled them. And then in more recent years, Joanne Price has done a lot for the business district. And the revival of the chamber, I think, has done a lot. I've been a Kiwanis member for probably, not 40 years, 35 years. And Kiwanis and Lions have done a lot for the community. So these organizations, the Scouts is a strong organization and has helped our young people. So all of these qualities of small town life were important to us, and I still think are important to people who reside here. Another story I was going to share and almost forgot. One of the jokes was about the size of Elmore when I came. And one of the statistics they gave me was that in 1871 the population of Elmore was 1,300. In 1971 the population was 1,300, and probably most of those were the same 1,300. So that was one of the jokes about how things stayed the same in Elmore. But there have been changes. The Turnpike exit, which not everybody was in favor of, I think has been a help to Elmore and has changed things, a lot more traffic. Shadell's has always been an important part, but probably more people know about Tank's Meats in Elmore and Benches than they do about Shadell's. But as I've been out in other communities and tell them I'm from Elmore, it's Tank's Meats and Benches that they know about.
Okay, we're continuing on here with John Bock. I was going to ask you, what were you doing during the blizzard of 78?
During the blizzard of 78, I was looking out the window, listening to the radio, and trying to think about how bad this was going to get. I had both a wedding and a funeral canceled because of that blizzard. And the funeral we didn't have till a week later. The couple that was supposed to get married, I thought they might wait till the following weekend too, but they decided they wanted to go ahead and just come on their own Sunday afternoon, and they got married just with their families there. So that was interesting how that turned out.
Do you remember who they were?
Yes. Debbie Klostermeyer married a Blasey, and his first name is not coming to me right now. But it was Debbie Klostermeyer.
And did the church help out some stranded people or people in town that needed anything?
The Methodist Church seemed to be the center for that, but again, it was the churches working together. We just decided that would be a central location. But I heard lots of stories about people walking down the river trying to get home and not realizing how bad it was. That morning when they predicted it was going to get bad and had started snowing, I decided to go out to the grocery store and get some extra bread and milk. And I could see to the flashing lights, so I thought, this isn't a problem. But just in the few minutes it took me to get out there, I realized after I got past the flashing lights and the blocking of the trees, as soon as you got to the open field, it was really deep. And I did get through that. But then on the way...
Sorry, I had to stop you there. So you were just passing the flashing light. It was getting too bad.
And then on the way back from the grocery store, I wondered how it was going to be, because it was just a total whiteout. You couldn't see anything. And my two biggest concerns were that there would be a car in front of me and I wouldn't see it, or that a car would come from behind and not see me. Well, I got in the deepest part of the snow and there was a car in front of me. So I had to stop and get out and push them out, and somebody else was in the car that did get them going. By the time I got back to my car, there was so much snow in my glasses I could hardly see, so I got in my car still hoping no one would hit me from the back, and did get through the snowdrifts and get back to town, but it was scary. I didn't try to go anyplace else after that.
That was wise.
Yes. It was interesting that started with so much rain, and I think it was 2 or 3 days later that we finally dug down and started to shovel out the sidewalks. That was before we had the snowblower. And even after 3 days, there was still water underneath the snow on the sidewalk, because the snow had formed insulation and the water had never frozen underneath there, even though it was 15 below zero on top. So that's what I remember that one. And well, there was one in 77 and 78. We always talked about the last Sunday of January, we just canceled church because we were going to have a blizzard. But again, all of the people who could walk that Sunday did go to the Methodist church, and we had a joint service. I think there were 50 of us there or something like that. So that's how we cooperated. You mentioned earlier about some people that I remembered.
That was going to be my next question, actually. So.
Oh, really? George and Emmeline Brandow were an important part of the community and our church. Emmeline's father had been the minister at the church at one time, so she grew up here and stayed active in the church. We called her our Miss Hospitality, because she was always right there to welcome any newcomer, and just had a gracious personality. She was also the first woman church council president we had, and that was interesting. Then later on, her daughter Jean Vance was another one of our women presidents. Burton and Velda James were our neighbors on the corner, and they were always good friends of ours. Florence Waters lived behind us, and her husband, and his first name escapes me right now, but he was active in the state agricultural department. And he had irises from all over the world, so he had this iris garden in his backyard that we got to enjoy for probably the first 5 or 10 years we were here. He died not too many years after we came, and then his daughter Joanne kept it up for a while, and Florence would work out there too, but it got smaller and smaller until they couldn't keep it up anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And there were many other people, those are the ones that come to mind. Bob and Harriet Verbeek, we used to say, whenever the doors of the church are open, they'll be there. They were very active. Probably forgetting some other people right now, but had many good relationships over those years.
Mm-hmm. Any interesting stories that happened at church there?
Oh yes, there's just story after story. The couple of goofs I made that they never let me forget is I said one time, "Let us hymn the next sing," instead of sing the next hymn. And then I mispronounced Hark Herald the Angels sang some way and messed that up. So they were always quick to point out my mistakes. And then my wife, being from South Bend, Indiana, was always a Notre Dame fan. So the few years that Notre Dame and Ohio State would play each other, Ohio State won both of those games. And I got up at church next morning, and the pulpit and the altar were full of Buckeyes. They gave me a hard time about that. Those are some of the funnies I remember.
Anything funny happened to people in the congregation that you remember?
Yes. I'll tell a couple of them. Sammy Preston, Sam and Jan's son. I remember him coming up one Christmas Eve, and all by himself during the offering. He just stood and knelt in front of the manger scene and had his own little prayer time. He was unique. And then Dane Mickelson was another one of the children. He was about a year old when they realized that he had a dislocated hip. So he ended up having braces on his legs where they were at a V, and then they had a bar in between them. But that didn't keep him from crawling up there for the children's story. He was a regular every week. And then I think when he was about 4, I was saying the pastoral prayer, and he began repeating it word for word after me. And I tried to vary my pace, and nothing changed. He just kept right up. And then another story about Dane at that time was one time when he thought I had prayed too long, he said, "Amen, Bock, amen." That reminds me of a grandchild story. Jordan is our oldest grandson. And when he was here visiting one time, he was about 4, and I came out for the church service, and I guess that was the first time he remembered seeing me in a robe. But instead of calling it a robe, he said, "Grandpa has a new dress." And of course, the congregation got to hear all that. And the other story I'll tell on some of the young people is when Kurt Amstutz was little, and the children were up on Christmas Eve for the children's story, and we were talking about all the characters in the manger scene. And they had mentioned all of them except the wise men, and so Kurt finally said, "Those are the wise guys." So that was his modern interpretation of the wise men, the wise guys.
Well, those are some gems.
Yes, yes.
Is there anything else that you want to add before we
No, I
conclude
think
here?
that's all I have right now.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. We really
I appreciate your asking me.
Mm-hmm.